The first sign that something had gone very wrong was not the explosion. It was silence somewhere inside Israel's northern military system. Units that were supposed to be receiving orders, reporting losses, requesting resupply, and coordinating air defense suddenly found parts of the network gone. A brigade can survive being hit. A brigade can survive losing vehicles. What it cannot survive is losing the system that tells it what to do, where support is coming from, who is still alive above it, and how long the rest of the line is holding. When that disappears, a military formation does not have to be physically erased to be operationally destroyed. That is where the story begins, not with 300 missiles as a statistic, not with slogans, not with whichever triumphant or reassuring headline is most politically convenient. It begins with the command architecture in northern Israel being hit so hard, so intelligently, and so simultaneously that 5 brigades ceased to function as coherent brigades. And that matters because the real story is not that Iran launched a huge strike. The real story is that Iran appears to have built over many years exactly the strike package needed to expose the upper limit of Israel's defensive system in the theater that mattered most. That is a different order of event. If the field picture is even close to accurate, what was hit was not random. Northern Command is not a ceremonial headquarters. It is the operational center of gravity for Israel's northern front. It links ground formations, air defense, logistics, communications, and contingency response across the Lebanese and Syrian corridors. It is not just a place, it is a system. And the reason this strike is so serious is that it seems to have been aimed at the system, not merely at the symbol. This is the point that gets lost when people use the word destroyed carelessly. When I say those brigades were destroyed as functioning formations, I am not saying every soldier died or every platform burned. I am saying the connective tissue that turns manpower and equipment into combat power appears to have been severed. No command coherence, no reliable comms, no intact logistics flow, no stable upward reporting, no synchronized fire control once those disappear. The brigade still exists administratively, perhaps even physically in parts, but not in the military sense that matters during war. It becomes a force without a nervous system. That is why this was not simply an impressive barrage. It was a systems attack, and systems attacks require more than anger. They require mapping. They require time. They require sustained intelligence preparation. Somebody studied where the critical node sat, where the redundancy lived, which supporting hubs mattered, which communications relays connected which formations, and what set of impacts would turn local damage into theater-wide paralysis. That is why I do not look at this and see improvisation. I see patience, which brings us to the missile defense question, because that is the question that will dominate public discussion and be answered badly almost everywhere. Israel's defensive architecture is real. It is sophisticated. It is the product of enormous investment. Iron Dome, David, Sling, Arrow. This is not junk technology, and it is not performative, but missile defense has never been a binary of works or does not work. It is always a problem of scale, timing, and magazine depth. How many inbound threats can be serviced at once? How many interceptors are available in theater? How rapidly can batteries hand off targets? How much processing time exists inside the engagement window? What survives after the first layer spends its first answer? That is the real math. Once the attacker understands that math, the game changes. The objective is no longer to beat every layer. The objective is to exceed the system's practical service ceiling and guarantee that enough residual missiles reach the correct nodes at roughly the same time. If 300 Khaibar-Shikan missiles were indeed committed to this target package, then what Iran was really testing was not the dignity of the air defense system, but its throughput limit. And what happened suggests that limit was found. This is one of the hardest truths for advanced militaries to admit. A shield can be excellent and still be finite. A shield can work exactly as designed and still lose when the attacker has designed the strike against the shield's ceiling rather than against its reputation. That appears to be what happened here. Iran did not build a missile program for prestige. It built one for this problem. The Khaibar-Shikan matters not because it is exotic or because its name sounds dramatic. It matters because of what it represents inside Iranian strategic thinking range, maneuverability, guidance independence, warhead logic. All of it points toward one objective: create a weapon that can survive the layered defenses the United States spent years helping its regional partners build, not symbolically challenge them, operationally complicate them. This is where years of Western misreading become expensive for too long. Sanctions were treated as if they guaranteed technological stagnation. Deny access to Western components, deny access to banking channels, deny access to procurement networks, and eventually the adversary will hit a ceiling. That assumption always rests on a fantasy that serious adversaries stop learning because they become poorer. They do not. They improvise. They substitute. They absorb outside knowledge. They study. They adapt where the defender is most rigid. Iran did exactly that. Russian technical experience mattered in the background, especially in ballistic logic and systems learning. Chinese technological channels mattered in ways the public discussion still understates. But one of the most damaging gifts the United States ever handed Iran came from its own loss. When the RQ-170 Sentinel fell into Iranian hands in 2011, the Iranians gained more than a trophy. They gained a tutorial. They gained access to American navigation assumptions, signal trust architecture, and the deeper problem of how a high-end system decides what reality is. That kind of insight does not vanish. It enters the bloodstream of later programs. So when people ask how a sanctioned state built a GPS independent or GPS resistant guidance architecture capable of surviving modern defensive environments, the honest answer is that it learned under pressure, and it learned partly from us. That is what makes this so uncomfortable. The deepest level of failure here is not battlefield failure. It is institutional failure for years. Serious analysts have warned that the American and Allied procurement cycle moves too slowly, assumes too much continuity, and mistakes technical sophistication for strategic sufficiency. The attacker gets a vote. More than that, the attacker gets time. Democratic defense systems buy, deploy, budget, test review, modernize in stages, and justify everything through institutional channels that are slow by design. Meanwhile, the adversary sits outside those rhythms and builds directly against what you have already fielded. That is not a theory anymore. That is what this looks like in practice. Iran built offensive packages against a defensive world that was already on the map. Now consider Israel's options from here. It can escalate and try to reassert deterrence by broadening the fight. But that road opens onto a larger regional war whose next steps are not fully controllable by any one actor. It can seek emergency restoration through American interceptor transfers, intelligence support, and rapid logistical repair. That will happen. But that road treats the symptom, not the strategic problem. Or it can seek ceasefire from the position it now occupies, not because that position is comfortable, but because the alternative may be worse. And that third road tells you the most states do not seek ceasefire at moments like this unless military leadership has come to a cold conclusion. Continued fighting under current conditions is likely to produce outcomes more dangerous than pause. That conclusion, if it has been reached, says, more than any official statement will, Washington, meanwhile, faces its own narrowing decision tree. It can accelerate support, which it will. It can talk tough, which it will. It can quietly help restore Israeli defensive depth, which it will. But the actions most likely to change the underlying strategic geometry are direct American attacks on Iranian missile infrastructure at scale. That option exists militarily. The problem is political willingness. And Iran has built its deterrence architecture around that gap, Hormuz, regional bases, proxy thresholds, economic shock capacity. These are not random levers lying around a cluttered strategy room. They are a designed environment. They are there to make direct American entry feel like the start of a much wider bill, one that administrations may prefer not to pay unless absolutely forced. That means the difference between what Washington can do and what Washington will do becomes one of the most important variables in the entire crisis. That gap is being watched everywhere. Russia will study the military lesson, how many missiles, what sequence, what node selection, what saturation threshold, what command effects. China will study the diplomatic opening and the credibility damage. American partners across the Gulf will study something simpler and more dangerous, whether the security architecture they trusted is still sufficient against adversaries that build asymmetrically but intelligently. Smaller states across the developing world will study yet another lesson, one that matters far beyond this theater. You do not need to match an advanced adversary platform for platform. You need to identify the limit inside its defense and force the fight there. That is why this strike matters globally. For more than 30 years after the Cold War, the United States and its close partners enjoyed a kind of psychological monopoly. Not only superior force, but superior inevitability. The assumption was that advanced systems, layered properly, would keep strategic surprise within manageable bounds. What northern Israel appears to have demonstrated is that this monopoly is no longer secure. Not because the United States has become weak, because adversaries have become more methodical in building against its dependencies. And once that happens, every future conflict changes. The most serious question now is not whether Iran possesses this capability. That question has been answered. The serious question is whether the institutions on the other side are capable of learning at the depth required to respond, not with a press conference. not with another emergency shipment alone, not with the familiar oscillation between maximum pressure and partial diplomacy that has characterized Iran policy for decades. I mean, real learning, a willingness to ask what sort of regional order could actually be stabilized, what strategic interests Iran will never surrender, what assumptions about deterrence no longer hold, and what systems must be redesigned because the attacker has already solved the version we deployed. That kind of institutional honesty is rare. It usually arrives only after shock. Maybe 5 shattered brigades and a degraded northern command are enough. Maybe they are not. Institutions are remarkably good at absorbing evidence without surrendering worldview. They call it resilience when it works and continuity when it does not. But what happened here will not be easy to hide inside continuity language. Over in northern Israel, the old story about defensive supremacy met the newer story about offensive adaptation, and the newer story won the engagement. That does not mean Iran is stronger in every sense. It means strength is no longer measured the way the old institutions still want to measure it. The missiles were dramatic, but they were not the deepest event. The deepest event was the exposure of a ceiling that had been denied for years. And once a ceiling becomes visible in war, everyone starts building for the room above it.